The King of France was dying without a son, and he knew that when his heart stopped, 300 years of unbroken succession would die with him. Charles IV lay in his bed at Vincennes Castle, February 1st, 1328, his body burning with fever, his mind crystal clear with the terrible understanding that he had failed at a king's most basic duty, creating an heir. 3 marriages, 3 desperate attempts, 0 surviving sons. His pregnant wife, Marie, was in the next room, but Charles knew, somehow he knew, that child would never wear the crown either. In 12 years, 3 brother kings had died. Louis, Philip, Charles. All dead in their prime, all leaving daughters or dead infant sons. The direct male line of the Capetians, the dynasty that had built France from a collection of feuding duchies into Europe's greatest kingdom, would end in the next few hours with his final breath. But here's what Charles couldn't know as he lay dying. His failure to produce an heir wouldn't just end a dynasty. It would start a war that would last 116 years, kill 3.5 million people, and transform medieval Europe into something unrecognisable, all because one man's seed couldn't create a living son. They say the 100 Years' War was about glory, about chivalry, about the rivalry between England and France. The truth is much more simpler and much more pathetic. It was about an empty cradle in a royal nursery, and the fact that sometimes the entire fate of civilization hangs on whether one sperm cell successfully meets one egg. Chapter 1. The curse begins. But to understand why Charles IV died without an heir, why his brothers died without heirs, why an entire dynasty seems suddenly incapable of producing male offspring, you have to go back 14 years to a morning in March when the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar was burned alive on an island in the Seine, and with his final breath, cursed the royal line of France to extinction. March 18th, 1314, the Ile de la Cité in the heart of Paris. Jacques de Molay had been in prison for 7 years, tortured until he confessed to heresies he hadn't committed, watched his warrior monk brothers hunted down like animals across Europe. Now, at 70 years old, he was being dragged to a wooden stake while crowds gathered to watch the spectacular finale of the Templar persecution. King Philip IV, called Philip the Fair for his handsome face that masked a soul of pure calculation, sat on a specially constructed platform to watch his enemy burn. Philip had destroyed the Templars for the oldest reason in royal history. They had money and he needed it. The warrior monks who'd protected pilgrims to the Holy Land had become Europe's first international bankers. Philip owed them 40,000 livres, easier to burn your creditors than pay them. The fire was lit. The crowd expected screaming, begging, the usual symphony of public execution. Instead, as the flames reached his chest, Jacques de Molay raised his voice not in pain but in prophecy. "God knows who is wrong and has sinned," he called out, his voice carrying across the silent square. "Soon a calamity will occur to those who have condemned us to death. Pope Clement, King Philip, before the year is out, I summon you to meet me before God's throne to answer for your crimes." The crowd gasped. Philip went white. A dying man's curse was serious business in 1314, especially when that man was the Grand Master of an order that had supposedly possessed mystical powers. Philip tried to laugh it off, but his courtiers noticed his hands were shaking. 33 days later, Pope Clement V died, supposedly of a sudden illness, but actually of intestinal cancer that caused his body to burst into flames during his funeral when a candle fell on his corpse, the fire consuming him just as fire had consumed de Molay. Philip, disturbed but still confident, increased his security and avoided public appearances. It didn't matter. On November 29, 1314, 8 months after de Molay's curse, Philip the Fair died of a stroke while hunting. He was 46 years old and had seemed in perfect health that morning. His last words, according to his confessor, were the curse, the Templar's curse. Whether he actually said this or whether it was added later by chroniclers who loved a good story, doesn't matter. What matters is that everyone believed it. The Capetian dynasty which had ruled France since 987, was now living under a shadow of supernatural vengeance. Philip left 3 adult sons, which should have been more than enough to secure succession. Louis X, already 25 and married, became king immediately. The curse seemed to have died with Philip. Louis was young, healthy, vigorous. He had a daughter already, and his wife Margaret was young enough to produce many more children, including the essential son. Except Margaret was currently imprisoned in the Chateau Gaillard for adultery, part of the Tour de Nesle scandal that had rocked the French court. Louis needed to remarry, needed a son, needed to break free from whatever shadow his father's crimes had cast. The Pope, now John XXII, granted an annulment with suspicious speed. Margaret conveniently died in prison shortly after. Strangled, the rumours said, though officially she perished of natural causes. Amazing how many natural causes involved crushed windpipes in medieval France. Louis married Clementia of Hungary 5 days after Margaret's death was confirmed. 5 days. The obscene haste revealed the panic beneath the crown. Clementia was young, fertile, from a family of proven breeders. She was pregnant within 2 months. The kingdom exhaled. The curse was broken. The dynasty would continue. Then on June 5th, 1316, Louis decided to play tennis. It was a hot day, and the king, always impulsive, played match after match in the blazing sun. Exhausted and overheated, he retired to a cool cellar and demanded wine. The servants brought him chilled wine from the deepest part of the castle's stores. He drank deeply, bottle after bottle, the cold liquid shocking his overheated system. Within hours he was seized with fever and violent stomach cramps. Some said poison. His cupbearer did disappear that very night. Others said it was the shock of cold wine in a heated body. The doctors, those medieval butchers who thought bleeding solved everything, made things worse with their treatments. Louis X died on June 9, 1316, after 4 days of agony. He was 26 years old and had been king for less than 2 years. But here's where the curse showed its cruelest twist. Queen Clementia was pregnant. The succession hung on an unborn child. If it was a boy, he would be king. If a girl, the throne would pass to Louis's brother Philip. For 5 months, France held its breath. The most powerful kingdom in Europe was ruled by a fetus. Philip acted as regent, but every decision was provisional, every decree temporary, waiting for a baby to be born. November 15, 1316. Clementia went into labour. The entire court gathered outside her chambers. Priests chanted prayers. Nobles placed bets. After 12 hours of screaming that echoed through the Louvre Palace, a cry was heard. A different cry. A baby's cry. The midwife emerged, her face unreadable. "A son," she announced. "The king lives." John I of France had just become the youngest monarch in European history. The curse was broken. The celebrations began. Wine flowed in the streets of Paris. Church bells rang from Normandy to Provence. For exactly 5 days. On November 20th, the infant king died. No violence, no obvious illness. The baby simply stopped breathing. Some whispered about a pillow over the face, Philip's ambition overcoming uncle's love. Others said the child was marked by the curse from conception, doomed to die before he could even focus his eyes. John I remains the only French king to reign from birth to death without living long enough to be crowned. His entire reign fit within a single week. Philip V took the throne immediately, before anyone could suggest that maybe, just maybe, Louis's daughter Joan had a claim. This was the first crack in the principle of male primogeniture, the first time the lawyers had to scramble to justify why a daughter couldn't inherit. They found an old Frankish law, the Salic law, that supposedly barred women from inheriting land. It was questionable whether this applied to the crown, but Philip had the army and Joan was 4 years old. Legal arguments are always more convincing when backed by swords. Philip V understood the assignment perfectly. He needed sons. Not just one son, multiple sons, spares for the heir, insurance against the curse that everyone now openly discussed. He had the advantage of already being married to Joan of Burgundy, who'd proven her fertility with 3 daughters. Surely a son would follow. The daughters kept coming. 4, 5 daughters. Philip spent fortunes on pilgrimages, on masses for divine intervention, on physicians who promised their potions would guarantee male offspring. Joan endured pregnancy after pregnancy, her body breaking down with each failed attempt to produce the one thing that mattered. The courtiers began to whisper that the curse didn't just kill kings, it killed their Y chromosomes. Philip became obsessed with breaking the curse through righteousness. If his father had been damned for persecuting the Templars, Philip would be saved by piety. He founded churches, gave lavishly to the poor, even attempted to launch a new crusade to prove God's favour. Nothing worked. The daughters kept coming, healthy and useless for succession. By 1321, Philip was desperate enough to consider the unthinkable, legitimising one of his bastard sons. The Pope refused. Legitimising bastards would undermine the entire concept of sacred royal blood. Better to let a dynasty die than pollute it with common seed. The irony was that Philip V was actually a good king. He reformed the bureaucracy, stabilised the currency, and kept France at relative peace. But none of that mattered if he couldn't produce a son. By late 1321, the stress was literally killing him. He developed what the court physicians called a flux of the bowels, probably dysentery or Crohn's disease. The man who needed to generate life was instead bleeding it out daily. He tried to hide his condition, but everyone could see the king growing thinner, paler, more desperate. On January 3rd, 1322, Philip V died at Longchamp, clutching his stomach and calling for a son that never existed. He was 28 years old. 5 daughters survived him, 0 sons. Charles IV took the crown with grim determination. He was the last brother, the last chance. At 27, he was young enough to father children, but old enough to understand what was at stake. His situation was even worse than his brother's. He was married to Blanche of Burgundy, who was still imprisoned for adultery from the same Tour de Nesle affair that had doomed Louis's wife Margaret. Charles needed an annulment, a new wife and a son in that order, as fast as humanly possible. The annulment came quickly. Blanche was declared insane and locked away in a convent. Whether she was actually insane or driven mad by 7 years of imprisonment is one of those questions medieval chronicles don't bother answering. Charles's second marriage was pure political calculation. He chose Marie of Luxembourg, sister of the King of Bohemia, a woman from a family that bred like rabbits. The wedding was conducted with unseemly haste, the bedding witnessed by half the court to ensure consummation. Marie was pregnant within weeks. Finally, the curse would break. In 1324, Marie gave birth to a daughter. Then she died in childbirth with the second child, another daughter who lived only a few hours. 2 females, 2 deaths. The curse was getting more creative in its cruelty. Charles was now 30, unmarried again, and running out of time. The courtiers could see it in his eyes, the same desperate look his brothers had worn before their deaths. The third marriage was beyond calculation. It was pure panic. Charles chose his cousin, Joan of Evreux, who was 17 to his 31. She was practically a child, but she was healthy, fertile, and available. The wedding in July 1325 was a subdued affair. Everyone knew what this was, a last desperate attempt to cheat fate. Joan became pregnant immediately. Then pregnant again. 2 daughters. By 1327, Charles could feel death approaching. It wasn't anything specific. No disease like Philip's dysentery. No sudden illness like Louis's wine episode. Just a certainty that time was running out. He began putting his affairs in order, writing letters to nobles, securing their loyalty for whom? He didn't even know who would succeed him. The fever started in January 1328. Charles knew immediately this was the end. As he lay dying in Vincennes, he could see the Great Seal of France on his bedside table, waiting to be passed to someone. His pregnant wife Marie was in the next room, but Charles had given up hope. 3 brothers, 3 dead kings, and between them all, not a single surviving legitimate son. As his breathing grew laboured, Charles might have thought about that morning 14 years ago when Jacques de Molay burned. Had the old Templar really cursed them, or had the dynasty simply run out of luck? Did it matter? The result was the same. The direct male line of the Capetians was about to end with his final breath. The lawyers and nobles gathering outside his chamber were already debating succession. If Joan's child was a son, he would be king. If a daughter, then what? Charles's sister Isabella was Queen Mother of England. Her son Edward III had a claim through her. Philip of Valois, Charles's cousin, had a claim through pure male descent. The Capetian blood ran through dozens of noble veins, but none in the direct line that had ruled for 3 centuries. Charles IV died on February 1st, 1328, aged 33. His last recorded words were, "At least I will see my brothers again." Whether he meant in heaven or hell, he didn't specify. Chapter 3. The She-Wolf's Gambit. 2 months after Charles IV's death, his widow Joan gave birth. It was a girl. With that single disappointing cry in the birthing chamber, 341 years of direct male Capetian rule officially ended. France had no king. But it did have 2 claimants, and one of them was already sharpening her claws. Isabella of France, sister to 3 dead kings, daughter of Philip the Fair, and Queen Mother of England, had been waiting for this moment for years. They called her the She-Wolf of France, though not to her face. Not anymore. Not since she'd orchestrated the deposition and murder of her own husband, Edward II of England, and ruled as regent for her teenage son. Isabella was 42 years old in 1328, and she'd learned that power wasn't inherited, it was taken. Isabella's claim was simple and logical. She was the last surviving child of Philip the Fair. Her son, Edward III of England, was Philip's grandson through the direct bloodline. Yes, the claim passed through a woman, but so what? There was no actual law saying the French throne couldn't pass through the female line. The Salic law the lawyers kept citing was about land inheritance in the 5th century, not royal succession in the 14th. If you wanted to talk about blood legitimacy, Edward III had more pure Capetian blood than any other claimant. The fact that he was also King of England was a complication, not a disqualification. Plenty of nobles held multiple titles. Why not a king? But Isabella's real power wasn't in legal arguments. It was in her ability to create facts on the ground. While French lawyers debated succession law, Isabella was already in France with an army, supposedly there to negotiate, but actually there to demonstrate that her son's claim came with teeth. She'd learned from her father Philip the Fair that possession was 9/10 of law. Grab first, justify later. The English controlled Gascony in southwest France, a massive duchy that gave them a permanent foothold on French soil. From there, Isabella could project power into the French heartland while maintaining the fiction of peaceful negotiation. The French nobility watched Isabella with a mixture of fear and fascination. This was the woman who'd fled England in 1325, supposedly in fear of her life, only to return with a mercenary army and her lover Roger Mortimer to overthrow her husband. Edward II's death at Berkeley Castle was officially recorded as natural causes, but everyone knew the truth. Red-hot poker inserted where the sun doesn't shine, a method that left no external marks but guaranteed an agonising death. If Isabella could do that to her own husband, the father of her children, what would she do to French nobles who opposed her son's claim? Edward III himself was a fascinating piece on this chessboard. 16 years old in 1328, he was everything a medieval king should be. Tall, handsome, skilled in arms, intelligent enough to understand, but young enough to control. Or so his mother thought. Isabella had been ruling England as regent since Edward II's deposition, and she assumed she'd continue ruling through her son. Edward played the dutiful son perfectly, attending ceremonies, signing what she told him to sign, speaking the words she put in his mouth. But behind those young eyes was a mind already calculating when and how to break free from maternal control. The English court's position on the French succession was carefully orchestrated by Isabella and Mortimer. They didn't immediately claim the throne. That would be too aggressive. Instead, they argued for Edward's right to be considered, to have his claim heard equally with others. It was a reasonable position that made the French look unreasonable for rejecting it. Every letter from the English court emphasised Edward's French blood, his respect for French law, his desire for peaceful resolution, all while English armies in Gascony were being reinforced and English gold was buying the loyalty of French nobles along the disputed borders. Meanwhile, Philip of Valois was making his own moves. As Charles IV's cousin through the male line, Philip had the advantage of being fully French, fully adult at 35, and fully present in Paris. While Isabella plotted from across the Channel, Philip was attending council meetings, leading prayers for the late king, being seen doing the work of kingship without claiming the crown. It was a masterful performance of humility, hiding ambition. Philip knew that the French nobility feared nothing more than an English king on the French throne. Every day Edward's claim was debated was another day for xenophobia to build. The assembly of French nobles that would decide the succession was scheduled for April 1328. Isabella made sure she was there, dressed in mourning black for her brothers, but with jewels that reminded everyone of her royal blood. She spoke eloquently about her son's rights, about the danger of breaking bloodline legitimacy, about how Edward would be a French king who happened to also rule England, not an English king conquering France. Some nobles were swayed. The Count of Flanders, dependent on English wool for his textile trade, openly supported Edward's claim. The Duke of Brittany, with his own succession disputes, saw advantage in supporting female line inheritance. But Philip of Valois had the better argument, or at least the argument that appealed to French pride. He stood before the assembly and asked a simple question. Will France, the greatest kingdom in Christendom, submit to be ruled from London? Will French nobles kneel to a boy whose mother murdered his father? Will we let the English, who we fought for centuries, take our throne through legal trickery? The hall erupted. Nobles who'd been wavering remembered every English raid on their lands, every English merchant who'd cheated them, every English arrow that had killed their kinsmen. The vote, when it came, wasn't close. Philip of Valois would be Philip VI of France. Isabella's reaction was perfect political theatre. She stood, tears streaming down her face. Real or performed, no one could tell. She denounced the Assembly's decision as illegal, immoral, and against God's law. She declared that her son's rights had been stolen, that Philip was a usurper, that this injustice would not stand. Then she swept from the hall with perfect dignity, every inch the wronged queen. But those who looked closely saw her exchange a glance with Roger Mortimer. It wasn't a glance of defeat. It was the look of conspirators whose real plan was just beginning. The coronation of Philip VI on May 29, 1328, at Reims Cathedral should have ended the succession crisis. The sacred oil was applied, the crown placed, the sceptre granted. By all the laws of God and man, Philip was now the legitimate king of France. The English delegation attended, officially recognising Philip's kingship. Edward III even did homage to Philip for his French territories, kneeling before him and swearing fealty as Duke of Gascony. It seemed like Isabella's gambit had failed. The Valois dynasty would replace the Capetians, and life would continue. Except everyone in that cathedral knew this was just intermission, not conclusion. Chapter 4. The cousin takes the crown. Philip VI's first problem as king wasn't Edward III, it was legitimacy itself. Yes, he'd been chosen by the assembly, crowned by the church, recognised by the nobility. But everyone knew he was king by default, not destiny. The direct line had failed, and he was simply the least objectionable alternative. Every decision he made, every decree he issued, carried the whiff of illegitimacy. Real kings were born to rule. Philip had been elected, and elected kings could be unelected if they showed weakness. From his first day on the throne, Philip ruled like a man trying to prove he deserved to be there, which of course proved he didn't. The relationship between Philip and Edward started with carefully orchestrated courtesy. When Edward came to Amiens in June 1329 to perform homage for Gascony, Philip went out of his way to be magnanimous. He threw elaborate feasts, gave expensive gifts, treated the teenage English king like a beloved nephew rather than a potential threat. Edward played his part perfectly, kneeling before Philip, placing his hands between Philip's hands, swearing to be his man for Gascony. But the words of the oath were carefully vague. Edward swore fealty for the lands he held in France, not specifically acknowledging Philip as rightful king of France. It was a diplomatic masterpiece that satisfied everyone and resolved nothing. Behind the pageantry, both courts were preparing for war. Philip began systematically undermining English control of Gascony, supporting local nobles who disputed English authority, encouraging tax resistance, making it clear that Edward's theoretical lordship meant nothing without French royal support. Edward, still under his mother's regency, couldn't respond effectively. Every protest from the English court was met with French legal procedures, delays, requirements for personal appearances that Edward couldn't make without leaving England vulnerable. It was administrative warfare, boring but effective. The breaking point came from an unexpected direction. In 1330, Edward III turned 18 and executed a coup against his own mother. In a dramatic midnight raid at Nottingham Castle, Edward's men arrested Roger Mortimer while Isabella screamed, "Fair son, have pity on gentle Mortimer." Edward had no pity. Mortimer was hanged as a traitor, and Isabella was forcibly retired to Castle Rising with a comfortable income but no power. The she-wolf had been caged by her own cub. Suddenly Philip VI wasn't dealing with a teenage puppet, but with a young king who'd proved he could be as ruthless as his grandfather Philip the Fair. Edward's first act as sole ruler was to reassess the French situation. His mother's claim had been about bloodline legitimacy. Edward's approach would be about power politics. He began building a coalition of everyone who had grievances with Philip VI. The Flemish cities, dependent on English wool for their textile industry, were natural allies. The Duke of Brittany, facing his own succession crisis, saw Edward as a useful counterweight to French royal power. The German emperor, always happy to weaken France, offered diplomatic support. Edward wasn't just claiming the French throne anymore, he was building a European alliance against Philip. Philip's response revealed his fundamental insecurity. Instead of ignoring Edward's provocations, he overreacted to every slight. When Edward sheltered Robert of Artois, a French noble who'd fled after a forgery scandal, Philip demanded his extradition. When Edward refused, Philip declared Gascony forfeit for breach of feudal obligations. It was a massive escalation that gave Edward exactly what he wanted: a legitimate reason to fight. Philip had turned a cold diplomatic conflict into a hot war, all because he couldn't tolerate any challenge to his authority. The economic war began before the military one. Edward banned the export of English wool to Flanders, devastating their economy and forcing them to choose between their French overlord and their English supplier. The Flemish chose money over loyalty, as merchants usually do. Philip retaliated by arresting English merchants in France and seizing their goods. Edward responded by repudiating his debts to Italian bankers who operated in France. Within months, the economic systems of both kingdoms were in chaos, all because two kings couldn't agree on who was the rightful heir to a dead man's throne. The propaganda war was equally vicious. Philip's court portrayed Edward as an unnatural son who'd imprisoned his own mother, a tyrant who ruled through fear, an island barbarian trying to corrupt pure French culture. Edward's propagandists painted Philip as a usurper who'd stolen the throne from its rightful heir, a coward who hid behind legal technicalities, a weak king who couldn't control his own nobles. Both sides cited prophecies, divine signs, and ancient precedents that proved their cause was just. Merlin had supposedly predicted an English king would rule France. Charlemagne had allegedly warned against cousins taking thrones from nephews. The dead were recruited to fight the living's battles. The personal insults escalated steadily. Philip called Edward the so-called King of England, implying his coup against Isabella made him illegitimate. Edward referred to Philip as Philip of Valois, who calls himself King of France, refusing to acknowledge his royal title. When they had to correspond, their letters were masterpieces of passive aggression. To our dear cousin Philip, instead of to His Majesty, given at our palace when writing from disputed territory. Every word was calculated to offend while maintaining plausible deniability. Medieval shade at its finest. The Church tried desperately to prevent war. Pope Benedict XII sent legates shuttling between London and Paris, proposing compromises that satisfied no one. Maybe Edward could be Philip's heir if Philip died without sons. Philip had sons. Maybe Gascony could be held independently of the French crown. That would destroy the feudal system. Maybe a marriage alliance could unite the claims. Both kings had already made strategic marriages. The Pope's efforts were doomed because this wasn't really about succession anymore. It was about two kings who'd gone too far to back down without losing face. And in medieval politics, losing face meant losing your head. By 1336, both kingdoms were obviously preparing for war while insisting they wanted peace. Castles were reinforced, armies mustered, alliances secured. But neither king wanted to be seen as the aggressor. They circled each other like fighters waiting for the other to throw the first punch. The excuse, when it came, was almost laughably trivial. A French knight attacked an English garrison in Gascony over a disputed toll bridge. The garrison commander was killed. Edward demanded justice. Philip offered to investigate. Edward said investigation wasn't enough. Philip said Edward was being unreasonable. And suddenly, somehow, they were at war. The final insult that made reconciliation impossible came at a feast in Paris in late 1336. Philip, drunk on wine and his own propaganda, made a public toast. To the merchants of London, may they find a true king, since their current one prefers playing at being French. It was meant as a joke, but it reached Edward's ears within a week. Edward's response was to stop playing. On October 7, 1337, he sent Philip a formal letter that didn't mince words. He, Edward, by right of blood through his mother Isabella, was the true king of France. Philip was a usurper. Any French noble who continued to follow Philip was a traitor. The 100 Years' War had officially begun, though no one called it that yet. They thought it would be over by Christmas. Chapter 5. The Spark Becomes Fire. Edward III's declaration that he was the rightful king of France should have been laughable. He controlled a few territories in France, commanded an army a fraction the size of Philip's, and was trying to usurp a crown that had already been placed on another man's head. But Edward understood something Philip didn't. Wars aren't won by the strongest, they're won by the smartest. And Edward was about to revolutionise warfare in a way that would make noble birth and chivalric tradition irrelevant. The 100 Years' War didn't begin with grand battles. It began with wool, gold, and targeted violence that would transform medieval combat into something recognisably modern. The wool embargo was Edward's masterstroke. England produced the finest wool in Europe, and Flanders turned that wool into cloth that made everyone rich. By cutting off the supply, Edward created an economic crisis that forced the Flemish to choose between their feudal obligation to France and their economic survival. They chose survival. By 1337, the major Flemish cities had recognised Edward as King of France, not because they believed his claim, but because they needed his wool. Jacob van Artevelde, the de facto leader of Ghent, put it bluntly. "We care not whether Edward or Philip sits on the throne, but we cannot eat sovereignty, and English wool feeds our children." Philip's response showed he still didn't understand the new rules. He sent a traditional feudal army to punish the Flemish rebels. Knights in shining armour, noble banners flying, all the pageantry of medieval warfare. The Flemish cities responded with militia armed with pikes and crossbows, merchants and craftsmen who fought in disciplined formations. At the Battle of Cassel in 1328, Philip had crushed such a militia, and he expected the same result. But the Flemish had learned. They refused pitched battle, retreated behind city walls, and let Philip's army exhaust itself besieging fortified towns, while English gold kept them supplied. Chivalry meant nothing against economics. Edward's military innovations were even more revolutionary. The English nobility had learned hard lessons fighting the Scots, who didn't follow the rules of chivalric combat. The Scots used terrain, ambush, and most importantly, the longbow, a weapon that could punch through armour at 200 yards and turn a charging knight into a pincushion. English nobles thought the longbow was a peasant weapon, unchivalrous and ignoble. Edward didn't care about chivalry, he cared about winning. He mandated longbow practice every Sunday, banned other sports that distracted from archery, and created a professional army of commoners who could destroy the flower of French nobility from a distance. The first real test came with the naval Battle of Sluys in June 1340. Philip had assembled a fleet to invade England, over 200 ships packed with knights ready to bring the war to English soil. Edward's fleet was smaller, but his ships were filled with longbowmen. The French admiral, Hugues Quiéret, chained his ships together to create a floating fortress, a traditional tactic that had worked for centuries. Edward's response was to turn the battle into a shooting gallery. English arrows fell like rain on the packed French ships. Knights in full armour, hit by arrows, fell into the sea and drowned. The French couldn't close to boarding distance where their superior numbers would matter. By sunset, the French fleet was destroyed. 20,000 Frenchmen were dead. So many bodies in the water that people said you could walk from ship to ship without getting wet. Philip received news of Sluys while at dinner. No one wanted to tell him directly, so his jester was pushed forward. "Oh, the cowardly English," the fool exclaimed. "They didn't jump into the sea like our brave Frenchmen." It took Philip a moment to understand he'd lost his entire fleet. His response was to execute the messengers, as if killing the news would change the reality. But Sluys had changed everything. It proved that traditional military superiority meant nothing against tactical innovation. A peasant with a longbow could kill a duke at distance. The age of chivalry was ending, murdered by mathematics and technology. The war's early years were characterised by what the French called chevauchée and what we call terrorism. Edward couldn't conquer France directly. He didn't have the men or resources. Instead, he sent raiding parties deep into French territory with simple instructions. Destroy everything. Crops were burned, livestock slaughtered, villages razed, civilians massacred. The goal wasn't conquest, but economic devastation. Every burned field meant less tax revenue for Philip. Every dead peasant meant one less soldier for his armies. It was total war centuries before anyone coined the term, and it was devastatingly effective. The French nobility was horrified and paralysed. This wasn't how wars were supposed to be fought. Wars were supposed to be about honour, about noble combat between equals, about ransoms and truces, and elaborate codes of conduct. Edward's raiders didn't take prisoners unless they were worth ransoming. They didn't spare churches, hospitals, or women and children. They created a desert and called it victory. When French knights rode out to stop them, the English simply retreated, refused battle, and attacked somewhere else. It was guerrilla warfare conducted by men who were supposed to be gentlemen. Philip's attempts to respond revealed the fundamental weakness of his position. As an elected king rather than a hereditary one, he couldn't afford to look weak. Every English raid that went unpunished undermined his legitimacy. But when he assembled armies to counter the raids, the English evaporated like smoke. His nobles began to grumble about paying taxes for an army that couldn't protect them. Some began negotiating separately with Edward, hedging their bets on who would ultimately win. The Count of Hainault, Philip's own brother-in-law, openly allied with Edward. The fabric of French feudal loyalty was unravelling. The psychological warfare was as important as the physical destruction. Edward had himself quartered the arms of France with those of England, visually claiming to be the true French king. He issued coins with French symbols, granted French titles to his supporters, held court sessions where he acted as King of France in the territories he controlled. Every action was designed to undermine Philip's legitimacy. If there were two men claiming to be King of France and one of them was winning, which one was real? The question itself was poisonous to royal authority. By 1345, the war had settled into a brutal rhythm. English raids would devastate a region. Philip would assemble an army to respond. The English would retreat to Gascony or back across the Channel. Philip's army would disperse because he couldn't afford to keep it in the field. The raids would begin again. France was bleeding to death from 1,000 cuts, and Philip seemed powerless to stop it. His nobles were losing faith, his treasury was empty, and his subjects were beginning to wonder if maybe Edward's claim had merit. After all, God favoured the righteous in battle, and Edward kept winning. The breaking point came in August 1346. Edward landed in Normandy with an army of about 15,000 men, a relatively small force by French standards. Philip could muster 30,000 or more. Finally, a chance for decisive battle where French numerical superiority would matter. Philip pursued Edward across northern France, determined to crush him once and for all. Edward retreated steadily, looking for the right ground to make his stand. He found it at a small village called Crécy-en-Ponthieu. The hill was gentle, the field of fire clear, the forest protecting his flanks. Edward arranged his longbowmen in a formation that would become legendary. Philip was riding into a trap, but his nobility wouldn't let him see it. Chapter 6. The 100 Years begin. The Battle of Crécy on August 26, 1346, wasn't just a military defeat for France. It was the violent death of an entire worldview. Philip arrived at the battlefield late in the afternoon, with his army strung out along miles of road, exhausted from pursuit. His scouts reported Edward's position on the hill, longbowmen arranged in triangular formations, knights dismounted and fighting on foot like common soldiers. Philip's nobles were disgusted. This wasn't war, it was cowardice. Real knights fought mounted, charging gloriously into battle. Philip, showing rare wisdom, wanted to wait until morning, rest his troops, organise properly. His nobles wouldn't hear of it. The Count of Alençon called him a coward. The Duke of Lorraine questioned his courage. These were the greatest knights in Christendom, they insisted. They wouldn't be stopped by English peasants with sticks and strings. The first French attack was by the Genoese crossbowmen, mercenaries Philip had hired because even he recognised the importance of missile weapons. But it had rained earlier, and the Genoese hadn't kept their bowstrings dry. Their shots fell short. The English longbows, strings protected by waterproof cases, responded with volleys that chroniclers compared to snow, so thick were the arrows in the air. The Genoese broke and ran. The Count of Alençon, seeing them flee, ordered his knights to ride them down. "Kill these cowards who block our path to glory." The French cavalry charged through their own retreating infantry, trampling hundreds of their own men to death. The French cavalry charge at Crécy should have been irresistible. Thousands of the finest knights in Europe, generations of martial tradition, the accumulated military might of the greatest kingdom in Christendom, all concentrated into a thundering wall of steel and horseflesh. But the English longbowmen weren't impressed. They'd spent years training for this moment, pulling bows with draw weights of over 100 pounds, developing muscles that deform their skeletons. Archaeologists can identify longbowmen by their enlarged left arms and twisted spines. Each archer could loose 12 arrows per minute. Do the mathematics. 5,000 archers, 12 arrows per minute. That's 60,000 arrows every 60 seconds. The French knights fell like wheat before a scythe. Arrows punched through mail, found gaps in plate armour, killed horses, and sent riders crashing to earth where they were crushed by those behind them. The charge became a stampede, then a slaughter. Knights worth fortunes in ransom were shot down like rabid dogs. The Count of Alençon, who called Philip a coward, died with 17 arrows in his body. The blind King John of Bohemia, in a gesture of magnificent stupidity, had his knights tie their horses to his and charged anyway. They found his corpse the next morning, still tied to his dead companions, riddled with arrows. Chivalry didn't die at Crécy, it committed suicide. Philip himself charged repeatedly, showing personal courage, even as his tactical sense failed completely. His horse was killed under him twice, an arrow lodged in his jaw. His sacred battle standard, the Oriflamme of Saint-Denis, fell in the mud and was trampled. As darkness fell and the scale of the disaster became clear, Philip's advisors physically dragged him from the field. The King of France fled to a nearby castle and banged on the gates, crying, "Open!" It is the unfortunate King of France. The unfortunate king had lost over 10,000 men, including the flower of French nobility. Edward lost fewer than 300. The mathematics of medieval warfare had changed forever. The aftermath of Crécy demonstrated Edward's strategic genius and Philip's political weakness. Edward didn't try to exploit his victory by marching on Paris. He didn't have the men for siege warfare. Instead, he besieged Calais, a port that would give England a permanent base on French soil. The siege lasted 11 months, during which Philip tried repeatedly to relieve the city, but couldn't face another pitched battle after Crécy. When Calais finally fell, Edward had his foothold, a door into France that would remain open for 2 centuries. Philip had to accept a truce that left Edward in control of expanded territories and his claim to the French throne intact. But the war's true horror was just beginning. In 1347, a Genoese trading ship brought something from the east that would make all the human violence seem trivial by comparison. The Black Death arrived in Europe, and suddenly both kingdoms had a more pressing enemy than each other. The plague killed without regard for nationality, class, or chivalric honour. It killed perhaps a third of Europe's population in 4 years, depopulating entire regions, destroying the economic basis for feudalism, creating social chaos that made organised warfare impossible. The 100 Years' War paused not because of peace, but because there weren't enough living people to fight it. Philip VI died in 1350, officially of natural causes, but really of exhaustion and despair. He'd spent 22 years as king, most of them at war, and left France weaker than he'd found it. His son John II became king, captured at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, in another demonstration that French nobility had learned nothing from Crécy. Edward III lived until 1377, dying peacefully in his bed after a reign that transformed England from a minor kingdom into a major military power. But neither man lived to see the war's end because there wouldn't be an end for another 76 years. The 100 Years' War became something neither Edward nor Philip could have imagined. Not a single conflict, but a multi-generational catastrophe that would define both nations. Periods of intense fighting alternated with truces, plagues, and civil wars. The original cause, who was the rightful heir of Charles IV, became almost irrelevant as the war developed its own momentum. English kings claimed the French throne long after any blood connection became meaningless. French kings fought to expel the English long after forgetting why they'd come. The war became its own justification, a hereditary hatred passed from father to son like a poisoned inheritance. The transformation of warfare that began at Crécy accelerated throughout the conflict. Gunpowder weapons appeared, making castle walls obsolete. Professional armies replaced feudal levies. Nationalism began replacing feudalism as the organising principle of society. Joan of Arc, a peasant girl who claimed divine visions, became a French military leader, something unthinkable in Philip and Edward's time. The war that began over feudal inheritance rights ended up destroying the feudal system itself. By the war's end in 1453, both England and France were unrecognisable from what they'd been in 1328. France was unified, centralised and powerful, but at the cost of millions of dead and the complete destruction of its medieval nobility. England had lost all its French territories except Calais, triggering the Wars of the Roses that would tear the kingdom apart. The aristocracy that had started the war was largely extinct, replaced by new men with new ideas. The medieval world had ended, and the modern world had begun, all because Charles IV couldn't produce a son. The final irony came centuries later when historians calculated the human cost. The 100 Years' War, including related conflicts and the plagues it helped spread, killed approximately 3.5 million people. That's 3.5 million deaths, because one man's testicles failed to produce viable male offspring. Each of those deaths was a person with hopes, fears, families, dreams, all extinguished because medieval law couldn't handle a simple succession crisis. If Charles IV had had a son, if any of the three brothers had produced a male heir, European history would have been completely different. No 100 Years' War, no Black Deaths spreading through military camps, no destruction of medieval civilization, no birth of nationalism. One chromosome, a Y instead of an X, and millions would have lived. That's the brutal mathematics of history. The fate of civilizations really can hang on whether one sperm cell successfully meets one egg. So there it is, the 100 Years' War, 3.5 million corpses, 5 generations of continuous warfare, the complete transformation of European civilization. All because Charles IV's sperm couldn't produce a son. We tell ourselves that history is shaped by great ideas, heroic leaders, technological innovations, divine providence. But sometimes, maybe more often than we want to admit, history turns on the microscopic failure of biological reproduction. One missing Y chromosome in 1328 created a cascade of death that wouldn't stop until 1453. Every arrow at Crécy, every burned village, every plague victim in a military camp, every mother weeping over a son who never came home, all of it traces back to an empty cradle in a French palace. The next time someone tells you that individuals don't matter in history, that great forces and trends determine everything, remember Charles IV dying without an heir. Remember how the fate of millions hung on one man's inability to produce a son. History isn't just shaped by what happens, it's equally shaped by what doesn't happen, by the children never born, the words never spoken, the decisions never made. The 100 Years' War is proof that sometimes the entire trajectory of human civilization can pivot on a single point of failure, so small it's literally microscopic. If this story kept you watching, if you need to know more about the forgotten hinges that history turns on, subscribe now and hit that notification bell. Because history's greatest catastrophes often hang by threads so thin you can barely see them. The massive wars, the fallen empires, the millions of deaths. Sometimes they all trace back to a single moment, a single failure, a single missing heir. Subscribe now and discover more of these devastating butterfly effects that shaped our world. And remember, sometimes those threads don't just fray. Sometimes they snap.